I was involved in some ways, for a time very close to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and know the Institute pretty well, know how it works and operates, etc. And I would say, first of all, the initiative for this institute came from within the Ukrainian Canadian community, and it started in a period of multiculturalism, when multiculturalism was coming to the fore as an official government policy. And local Ukrainian Canadians, including people like Manoly, Lupul and Peter Savaryn, saw this as an opportunity to found an institute in Alberta that would represent Ukrainian interests and Ukrainian studies. Lupul himself is retired now, professor of education. So, to begin with, that was obviously going to be a focus of the institute. The other people who were involved in those very first days were people like Iván Lisiak-Rudnytsky, well-known historian, Roman Petryshin, a sociologist, Bohdan Krawchenko, a political scientist, and Lupul himself, of course. Francis Swyripa, who works on Ukrainians in Canada, was also one of the early people involved in the Institute. So it moved in, I would say, a variety of directions at the same time, from the late 70s to probably 1986 or 5, whenever Lupul retired. And in many ways, I think it was quite successful. I mean, it focused a lot on publishing. And publishing in that period was a little different from what it is today. I mean, it was a profit-making thing, on paper at least, although in the end, of course, not many of these books made much profit. It was a pioneering one. And the Toronto office was also involved with people like Roman Senkus, who worked in Ukrainian literature, and the associate director, Yury Lutski, also was a literary scholar. So, CIUS, I would say, until at least the mid-80s, was an institute that moved in a lot of directions at once, and maybe too many directions at once. And at that time, it was under the Associate Vice President Research of the University of Alberta. And I would say more or less independent. I mean, they did not have to account for most of the activities. By 1986, or 85, maybe 85 is more accurate, Bogdan Krawchenko, political scientist, became the director. And Bogdan was a dynamic figure, I think, in many ways. And I just finished my PhD. I joined the Institute then as a research associate under Bogdan, and I remember him saying to me, Chernobyl's happened, you're one of the few people who know something about it, go work on it, and come back when you're done. And that's all he said. And, you had absolute freedom then to go and do what you want. And I found it a very refreshing kind of atmosphere, very exciting. I mean, this was an exciting period as well in the history of Ukraine, the politics of Ukraine, the period of the late 1980s to 1991 or 92. I mean, this was, to me, the best period in Ukrainian history to study. I mean, this was fantastic, what was happening. Changes all the time. You could actually go there, which was also very difficult before then for me, because I was a research fellow at Radio Liberty, and we were not allowed to travel over the Iron Curtain to the countries there. When what Therese calls the sort of American group started to come, really, I think they came because Bogdan wanted to go to Ukraine. He wanted to stay in Ukraine, and he wanted to get suitable replacements for him in Edmonton. And his choice was Frank Sisson, whom he knew well at Harvard, and he felt would be the kind of scholar that was needed. But for whatever reason, and there are a number of reasons, Frank didn't really want to live in Edmonton, and the ultimate result was he got in touch with Zen and Cahoot, and Zen and Cahoot came. I think after that period, with all due respect, the focus was on history. Strongly on history, and the other areas began to slowly fade a little bit. I think there were some other reasons perhaps why Ukrainian Canadian studies faded. One, of course, was the retirement of Manoly Lupul, who was the big inspirer of that period. The other was that the number of people writing in that area were relatively small. Many of the projects on which they embarked were lengthy things. The history of Ukrainians in Canada, for example, Oris Martinovich, a voluminous thing. I think he even finished quite recently with the second volume. It's gone on for years. And therefore, I think it experienced a lull, one could say. Multiculturalism was also slowly disappearing on the political horizon as well. Nobody was pushing for it so much anymore. The focus was on other things and Canadian politics. So the direction slowly moved, and perhaps Taras is correct when he says that the new directors were not really focused on Canada because Canada was not familiar territory for them. So they began to be completely preoccupied with other projects, such as the Hrushevsky project. And I think the Hrushevsky project, the biggest project ever undertaken by Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, but in fairness, it's probably gone on a bit too long. And therefore, to some extent, with the loss of Bohdan Krawchenko to Ukraine, there was not much focus on contemporary politics. And in the latter period, more current period, very little focus on language and education as well. And therefore, it seems a much narrower form of focus. So other institutes, of course, have opened across Canada who do focus more on these areas. I mean, in places like Saskatoon and Winnipeg and Regina, etc. I think, though, that the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies also lacked a kind of replenishment of resources. In other words, the people that were there stayed there for quite a long time, and the number of younger scholars working there clearly declined as well. Volodymyr Kravchenko has attempted to address this, for example, by a new postdoctoral program where he's brought in two excellent postdoctoral students, both originally from Ukraine, Iván Kozachenko and Alexander Melnik, both new PhDs, one from Aberdeen, one from Toronto. And this has begun to change things. But I think it's probably also necessary to bring in young scholars working in the Ukrainian Canadian field, which, I mean, there are many who are working in this field now. There's quite a few new PhDs in this area. And I would say also to broaden the focus again to language and education, because the Ukrainian language studies has really suffered at this university. For a number of reasons, I think there's been a focus on basically bums in seats, as the quote goes, getting people in large numbers to fill classes in every single subject. In other words, language programs are being treated exactly the same as first-year economic programs. First-year economics can get 1,200 students in a first-year class in different sections. But you can't put 1,200 people in a first-year language class, even if there are 1,200 people who wanted to study Ukrainian. I mean, how could you do that? Language classes have to be small. If you have more than 12, are you really getting the sort of attention you need if you're studying a language? So the way the system developed was really not going to help language classes in any way. And so they began to get cancelled. And when classes get cancelled, they began to get dropped. The Ukrainian major, even the Russian major, no longer existed, and they only became minor. This is something I think that could be addressed by an institute like the one in Edmonton, which once had, quite a strong language education program. And it could act as a kind of conduit for students who are more interested in, say, learning the Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian language, of course, was kept alive in some respects by Canada during the Soviet period. I mean, we were one of the places where you could actually come and study Ukrainian in schools. One or two schools still exist, but for the most part, that's very difficult to study Ukrainian anything other than, say, Saturday schools or pioneer camps or something of that nature. So the language inevitably will disappear if this state of affairs continues. And I think that's something that anyone will have to address at CIUS, the situation of the Ukrainian language. I think also topics like sociology are very important for the Ukrainian field. I mean, how often do we depend on sociological research in Ukraine? There's nowhere outside Ukraine, perhaps in the United States to some extent, but there's nowhere in Canada that you could look at some kind of sociological survey of Ukraine. It's simply not taking place. That area is also a kind of blank spot as far as we're concerned here. History is always going to be important, but also politics now, I would say, is the fourth field, because politics in Ukraine has suddenly become an extremely important topic. So, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies has to be a focal point for government, non-governments, officials, etc., getting information about Ukraine. Media, social media in particular, must come to us to get information. I say us, I'm no longer part of it, but must come to the Institute to get information about Ukraine. It's only logical, because here, that's where the expertise lies. So I think on the political side as well, it's very important that an Institute of Ukrainian Studies is focused on current politics. And I think that's something Volodymyr recognized from the very beginning, that this was an area that needed pushing much more strongly. Taras recognized that too, and I think he was correct on that point. So, in terms of the study of Ukraine generally in North America, we are far ahead of where we were in the 1990s, because we got far more scholars doing PhDs on Ukraine, doing postdocs on Ukraine, and maybe, a third of them have got no Ukrainian background whatsoever. They're simply interested in Ukraine. And that is something very positive. I mean, 20 years ago, if a student came to you and said he wanted to study France, no one would be surprised. But if they wanted to study medieval Ukraine, you would have fallen off your chair if they were not Ukrainian in background. This is no longer the case today. It's a legitimate field for any student to study, which is a good thing. The other good thing, and this is, I'm not trying to be more positive, whereas Taras was negative, but you have to recognize that the number of doctoral students studying Ukrainian history politics is rising, not falling. I mean, more and more students are coming to us in this department, my department, wanting to do PhDs in Ukrainian history. Many of these PhDs are on very contemporary periods as well. So if they're coming here, it shows that we must have some influence, right? There must be some reputation here, otherwise they wouldn't come all the way from Ukraine. But, I mean, we also have people from Belarus, Moldova, Eastern Europe, etc. So even though the number of language classes have declined, the number of students doing the language have declined, the number of students who want to do doctoral or graduate history programs has increased. Taras focused on history classes or undergraduate classes in Ukrainian politics history. The difficulty there is you've got to have people to teach these classes. When I was appointed, my role was to teach the history of the Soviet Union, or 20th century Russia, of which Ukraine was an important part. Last year, I had 60 students sign up for that class. And I would say we devoted about a third of it to Ukraine, one way or another. That would not appear on any statistical survey of how much Ukrainian is studied in this university, but it's there, right? We know it's there. Also, a seminar I've run on Euromaidan last year was completely full with a waiting list. So the interest is there. even 20th century Ukraine, which I taught about 3 years ago, had about 30 students in it. So the interest is there. And I think the difficulty, as far as University of Alberta is concerned, is that the people in these areas are all diverted by one thing or another. I mean, Heather Coleman is the editor of Canadian Slavonic Papers. She doesn't teach a full load. She's also been a, I forgot the name of it now, but it's a research scholar for the past 10 years, in fact, which has reduced the number of courses. John Paul Himker, as you probably know, retired fully effective June 30th of this year. He was teaching for us up to that time. He's no longer there. I'm the chair of the department. I only teach one class. So, for various reasons, we're not teaching as much as perhaps we should do. And I think that's something to think about in the years ahead. You need to put more courses on. There are, some good developments elsewhere. I mean, I was very impressed with the Ukrainian Studies program at Cambridge University, of the events that are taking place there. I mean, that's one of the most exciting places in the world for Ukrainian studies today. Harvard, where I think Serhii's leadership is really beginning to have an impact. And he himself is producing regularly important works on Ukraine. So, we have a lot of good people in place, and I think the future is not as dark as it appears. But I do take the point that we really need to think seriously about the undergraduate students working on Ukrainian topics. That is clearly the most important thing for the future, not only in politics and history, but also in education, and not least language. All those areas need to be covered.